What happens when a rock legend witnesses injustice on the street? Bruce Springsteen sees police officers arrest a black man, rough hands, angry voices, a community watching in silence. But the next day changes everything. The same man who was handcuffed yesterday now sits behind the judge's bench. Justice wears many faces. Sometimes the person you think you know isn't who they appear to be. Bruce Springsteen discovers that truth has more layers than any song he's ever written. The black man he saw arrested becomes the judge who will change his perspective forever. When music meets justice, when assumptions crumble, when humanity reveals its deepest truths. This is a story about seeing beyond the surface, about understanding that every person carries untold stories. Get ready for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know. The autumn rain fell steadily on the cracked pavement of Millfield's main street, each drop carrying the weight of a town that had seen better days. The streetlights cast long shadows between the old brick buildings, their warm glow fighting against the gathering darkness of evening. Bruce Springsteen pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders as he walked toward Murphy's Diner, the familiar neon sign flickering like a beacon in the storm. He had been driving through this small New Jersey town for hours, searching for nothing and everything at the same time. Sometimes the road called to him like that, demanding solitude and reflection. The rhythmic sound of his boots on wet concrete created a steady beat, like the opening of a song that hadn't been written yet. As Bruce approached the intersection near the courthouse, he noticed a commotion ahead. Blue lights flashed against the brick facade of the old municipal building, painting the scene in harsh, alternating shadows. 3 police cars surrounded a figure on the sidewalk, their radios crackling with static voices that cut through the evening air. Bruce slowed his pace, instinctively keeping to the shadows beneath the old oak tree that had stood sentinel on this corner for over a century. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most important moments happened when you thought nobody was watching. The man in the center of the attention was tall and dignified, probably in his late 50s, wearing a simple dark coat that had seen many seasons. His silver hair caught the streetlight, and even from a distance Bruce could see the calm composure in his posture. There was something about the way he held himself that spoke of inner strength, of someone who had faced adversity before and emerged with his dignity intact. "Sir, I need you to place your hands behind your back," one of the officers commanded, his voice carrying across the empty street with unnecessary harshness. The man complied without resistance, his movements slow and deliberate. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady and measured, educated. Each word was carefully chosen, spoken with the precision of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. "Save it for downtown," another officer replied curtly, snapping the handcuffs with more force than necessary. Bruce felt his chest tighten with familiar anger and frustration. He had witnessed scenes like this before, had written songs about injustice and inequality, but seeing it unfold in real time never lost its power to disturb him. The casual dismissal of human dignity, the assumption of guilt without evidence, the way authority could be wielded like a weapon against those who looked different or came from different circumstances. A small crowd had gathered on the opposite sidewalk, their faces partially hidden in the shadows, but their discomfort visible in their body language. They watched in silence, some shaking their heads, others simply staring with the kind of helpless resignation that came from witnessing something they felt powerless to change. The man being arrested never struggled, never raised his voice, never showed anything but quiet dignity, even as he was placed in the back of the patrol car. Through the rear window, Bruce caught a glimpse of his face, intelligent eyes that held no anger, only a deep sadness that seemed to encompass more than just this moment. As the police cars pulled away, their lights disappearing around the corner, the crowd slowly dispersed. People returned to their evening routines, their dinners growing cold, their television shows waiting. But Bruce remained standing under the oak tree, rain dripping from the brim of his cap, unable to shake the image of that man's face. Murphy's diner felt warm and welcoming after the chill of the street. The familiar smells of coffee and pie filled the air, mixing with the sound of quiet conversation and clinking dishes. Bruce chose a corner booth where he could see the street through the large windows, the neon beer signs casting colourful reflections on the rain-streaked glass. "Evening, hun," said the waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her name tag read Dorothy, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone who had been serving coffee and comfort to travelers for decades. "What can I get you started with tonight?" "Just coffee for now, thanks," Bruce replied, still distracted by what he had witnessed outside. Dorothy poured the steaming liquid from a well-worn pot, the ceramic mug warming his hands as he wrapped them around it. "You look like you've seen something troubling," she observed, with the gentle directness that came naturally to people who had spent their lives listening to strangers' stories. Bruce glanced up at her, noting the genuine concern in her expression. "Just watched a man get arrested outside the courthouse. Seemed like a decent fellow. Handled himself with real dignity." Dorothy's face darkened slightly, and she glanced around the nearly empty diner before sliding into the seat across from him. "You talking about Marcus Williams?" "Don't know his name. Tall gentleman, silver hair, well-spoken." "That's Marcus," Dorothy confirmed with a heavy sigh. "Been happening too often lately. Some folks in this town see a black man walking around after dark and assume the worst. Marcus never caused trouble for nobody, but that doesn't seem to matter to certain people." Bruce felt his jaw tighten. "What do you mean, been happening too often?" Dorothy looked around again, then leaned forward slightly. "Marcus moved here about 2 years ago, bought that little house on Elm Street. Keeps to himself mostly, always polite when he comes in here for coffee, but some people got it in their heads that he doesn't belong. Anonymous calls to the police, complaints about suspicious activity when he's just walking to the grocery store or tending his garden." The familiar fire of injustice burned in Bruce's chest. He had grown up in New Jersey, had seen firsthand how prejudice could poison a community, how fear and ignorance could turn neighbors against each other. What's his story? What brought him to Millfield? Nobody knows much about his past, and Marcus isn't one to volunteer information, but I can tell you he's one of the most educated men I've ever met. The way he talks, the books he reads when he sits in here, that's a man with learning behind him. Whatever brought him to our little town, I suspect it wasn't by choice." Bruce sipped his coffee, the bitter warmth providing little comfort against the chill of what he was learning. Through the window, he could see the courthouse steps, where just an hour ago a man's dignity had been stripped away in front of his neighbors. "Dorothy," he said quietly, "what do you know about the justice system here? The judges, the courts?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Justice. Honey, we got Judge Harrison presiding over most everything, and that man's about as fair as a rigged coin toss. Been on the bench for 30 years, thinks he's the king of this little kingdom. If Marcus ends up in front of Harrison tomorrow, well—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Bruce felt a familiar restlessness building inside him, the same feeling that had driven him to write songs about working-class struggles and social injustice. But songs weren't enough sometimes. Sometimes you had to act, had to step forward and use whatever influence you had to make a difference. "Dorothy, what time does court convene in the morning?" 9 o'clock sharp. Why? You thinking about showing up?" Before Bruce could answer, the diner door chimed, and 2 men in their 40s entered, shaking rain from their jackets. They chose a table near the window, and Dorothy excused herself to take their order. But Bruce couldn't help overhearing their conversation as they settled in. "Heard they finally got that Williams fellow," one of them said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made Bruce's stomach turn. "About time," replied the other. "Been walking around this neighborhood like he owns the place. Maybe now he'll get the message and move on." Bruce's hands tightened around his coffee mug. The casual cruelty in their voices, The assumption that they had the right to determine who belonged in their community represented everything he had spent his career fighting against through music. But music felt inadequate in the face of such immediate injustice. Dorothy returned to his table, her expression grim. "You heard them, didn't you?" Bruce nodded. "Is that the general attitude around here?" "Not everyone feels that way, but the ones who do make the most noise. They've got Judge Harrison's ear, probably helped put him on the bench in the first place. Marcus doesn't stand a chance tomorrow, not unless something changes." As Bruce sat in that diner, listening to the rain against the windows and the casual prejudice at the next table, he made a decision that would change his understanding of justice, dignity, and the power of second chances. He would be at that courthouse tomorrow morning, not as a celebrity or a rock star, but as a witness to whatever justice looked like in Millfield. The night stretched on, and Bruce found himself unable to leave the diner. Dorothy kept his coffee cup filled and seemed to understand his need for quiet contemplation. Other customers came and went, a few truckers stopping for pie, a young couple sharing a late dinner, an elderly man who ordered soup and read a paperback novel while he ate. Each person who entered brought with them a story, a life full of complexity and contradiction. Bruce had always been fascinated by the human condition, by the way ordinary people navigated extraordinary circumstances. But tonight, his thoughts kept returning to Marcus Williams, to the dignity with which he had accepted his arrest, to the intelligence Dorothy had seen in his eyes during quiet moments over coffee. Around midnight, as Dorothy was preparing to close, she sat down across from Bruce one more time. "You know, I've been thinking about what you asked earlier, about Marcus's story." Bruce looked up from his cold coffee, grateful for the distraction from his own spiraling thoughts. "About 6 months ago, Marcus came in here late one night, looked like he'd been crying. That's the only time I ever saw him show any real emotion. I asked if he was okay, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, 'Dorothy, sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything you thought you were.'" Those words hit Bruce like a physical blow. How many people lived with that kind of pain, that kind of sacrifice? How many had given up their identities, their positions, their comfortable lives in service of something larger than themselves? Did he say anything else? Just that he'd left behind a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt empty on the inside. Said he was learning what it meant to be truly free, even if freedom came with a price. Bruce paid his check and walked back into the night, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried its clean, washed smell. The streets were empty now, except for the occasional car passing through, headlights cutting through the darkness like hope through despair. He found himself standing again beneath the oak tree where he had witnessed the arrest, looking up at the courthouse steps. The building looked different in the darkness, more imposing and forbidding. Tomorrow morning, those steps would fill with people seeking justice, some finding it, others leaving disappointed or broken. Bruce thought about all the courthouses he had seen in small towns across America, all the local dramas and tragedies that played out behind their doors. Justice was supposed to be blind, impartial, but he had learned that it often wore the face of whoever held the most power or influence in a community. As he walked back to his car, Bruce made another decision. He would not only attend court in the morning, but he would also try to learn more about Marcus Williams. There had to be someone in this town who knew his story, who could provide the context that might make tomorrow's proceedings more bearable to witness. The motel where Bruce checked in was typical of small-town accommodations, clean but worn, functional but not comfortable. The night manager, a thin man in his 70s, recognized him immediately, but had the wisdom to keep their interaction professional and discreet. "Room 12 is quiet," he said, sliding the key across the counter. "Overlooks the parking lot instead of the highway." Bruce appreciated the consideration. Fame had its privileges, but it also came with the constant challenge of finding moments of genuine solitude and reflection. His room was simple but adequate. A double bed with a floral comforter, a small table and chair, a television that probably received 3 channels, clearly. But it was the silence he valued most, the absence of demands and expectations that allowed his thoughts to settle into clearer patterns. He sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the songs he had written over the years about justice and injustice, about the working class and the forgotten, about the American dream and its casualties. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight he wasn't observing from a distance or crafting art from other people's pain. Tonight he was a witness, a participant in a real-time drama whose outcome remained uncertain. Sleep came eventually, but it was restless and filled with dreams of courthouse steps and rain-soaked streets, of dignified faces and harsh voices, of justice wearing masks that changed with the lighting. Morning arrived grey and overcast, the kind of day that matched Bruce's mood as he prepared for whatever lay ahead. He dressed simply, jeans, a button-down shirt, his leather jacket, wanting to blend in rather than stand out. Today wasn't about Bruce Springsteen the performer, it was about a citizen exercising his right to observe his justice system in action. Murphy's diner was busy with the breakfast crowd, filled with working people grabbing coffee and eggs before starting their days. Dorothy waved at him from behind the counter, but was too busy to stop for conversation. Bruce ordered coffee and toast, eating quickly while listening to the conversations around him. Most of the talk was mundane: weather, work, family obligations. But at a table near the door, he overheard 2 women discussing the previous night's arrest with evident satisfaction. Their words were coded, but clear. They believed Marcus Williams had gotten what he deserved, and they hoped the judge would send a strong message. At 8:30, Bruce walked the 3 blocks to the courthouse. The building looked different in daylight, less imposing but somehow more significant. The American flag hung limp in the still air, and the inscription above the main entrance read, "Equal Justice Under Law," in weathered stone letters. A small crowd was already gathering on the steps and in the main hallway. Bruce recognized some faces from the diner, others from his brief walk around town the night before. The atmosphere felt charged with expectation and tension, like a storm waiting to break. The courtroom itself was exactly what Bruce expected from a small-town courthouse. Wooden benches worn smooth by decades of use, tall windows that let in natural light, an elevated bench where justice would be dispensed according to the wisdom and prejudices of whoever occupied it. Bruce chose a seat in the back, wanting to observe without being observed. Around him, the benches filled with a mixture of citizens, some clearly supporters of law and order as they defined it, others who seemed genuinely concerned about fairness and justice. At exactly 9 o'clock, a bailiff called the court to order, and everyone rose as Judge Harrison entered. He was a large man in his 60s, with thinning grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the final authority in any room he entered. His black robe seemed to amplify his presence, lending weight to his every movement and gesture. "Be seated," he commanded, and the crowd settled back onto the wooden benches. The morning docket began with routine matters: traffic violations, minor disputes, procedural hearings. Bruce watched and listened, getting a sense of Judge Harrison's temperament and approach. The man was efficient but cold, more concerned with moving through his caseload than with understanding the human stories behind each file. Then, at 10:15, the bailiff called, "The State of New Jersey versus Marcus Williams." Bruce felt his pulse quicken as the man from the previous night was led into the courtroom. Marcus wore the same dignity Bruce remembered, though his clothes were rumpled from a night in jail, and his hands were cuffed in front of him. As he walked to the defendant's table, his eyes swept the courtroom, taking in the faces of his neighbors and judges. For just a moment, those eyes met Bruce's, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that they were both strangers in this particular drama. "Mr. Williams," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority, You are charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. How do you plead?" Marcus stood slowly, his movement deliberate and graceful, despite the constraints of his handcuffs. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly throughout the courtroom, each word precisely enunciated. "Your Honor, I plead not guilty to both charges." A murmur ran through the crowd, some voices expressing surprise, others disapproval. Judge Harrison banged his gavel once, sharply. "The court will hear the state's case. Officer Martinez, please approach the bench." The arresting officer, a young man in his 30s with nervous energy and eyes that didn't quite meet Marcus's gaze, took the witness stand. His testimony was straightforward, but lacking in specific details. He had received reports of suspicious activity, had approached the defendant for questioning, and had been forced to make an arrest when the defendant became uncooperative and potentially threatening. Bruce listened carefully, noting the vague language and absence of concrete facts. The officer's account painted Marcus as evasive and hostile, but provided no specific examples of threatening behavior or actual resistance. "Officer Martinez," Judge Harrison asked, "in your professional opinion, did the defendant pose a threat to public safety?" "Yes, Your Honor. His attitude was confrontational, and he refused to comply with lawful orders." Bruce's hands clenched in his lap. He had witnessed the arrest, had seen Marcus comply with every request, had observed the calm dignity with which he accepted his situation. The officer's testimony bore no resemblance to reality. When it came time for Marcus to defend himself, he stood again with that same measured grace. Judge Harrison looked down at him with undisguised skepticism. "Mr. Williams, do you have representation?" "I will represent myself, Your Honor." Another murmur from the crowd, this one carrying notes of both surprise and derision. Who was this man to think he could match legal training with whatever education he possessed? "Very well, present your case." Marcus walked slowly to the center of the courtroom, still handcuffed, and faced Judge Harrison directly. When he began to speak, something in his voice made Bruce sit forward in his seat. "Your Honor, I have lived in this community for 2 years. In that time, I have been arrested 7 times, always on charges similar to these, always based on anonymous complaints about suspicious activity. In each case, the charges have been either dropped or dismissed due to lack of evidence. Yet here we are again, perpetuating a cycle that serves no one's interests, not justice, not public safety, not community harmony." His words carried the weight of experience and education, but more than that, they carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Bruce found himself leaning forward, struck by something familiar in Marcus's delivery, in his command of language and legal procedure. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, "I would like to present evidence that the arresting officer's testimony is inconsistent with the facts of this case." Judge Harrison's expression remained skeptical. "What evidence?" "I would like to call a witness who observed the entire incident." Bruce's heart stopped. Was Marcus going to call him to testify? He had witnessed the arrest, but he was a stranger here, a visitor with his own complicated relationship to celebrity and public attention. But Marcus turned instead toward the back of the courtroom, his eyes scanning the faces until they settled on an elderly black woman sitting alone in the last row. "I call Mrs. Sarah Jefferson to testify." The woman stood slowly, using a wooden cane for support. She was probably in her 80s, with white hair and eyes that held decades of experience with both injustice and perseverance. As she made her way to the front of the courtroom, Bruce could feel the tension in the air increase. Mrs. Jefferson was sworn in, her voice clear and strong despite her age. When Marcus asked her to describe what she had witnessed the previous evening, she looked directly at Judge Harrison and began to speak. "Your Honor, I was walking home from evening service at Mount Olive Baptist when I saw Mr. Williams on the courthouse steps. He was reading a book, just sitting quietly under the streetlight. 3 police cars pulled up, and the officers approached him with their hands on their weapons. Mr. Williams never moved aggressively, never raised his voice, never did anything but answer their questions politely and comply with their requests. When they handcuffed him, he said, "Officers, I believe there's been a misunderstanding, but I will cooperate fully." That's not the behavior of someone resisting arrest. Her testimony was delivered with quiet dignity and absolute certainty. Bruce could see its effect on the courtroom. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded slightly, as if hearing confirmation of something they had suspected but been afraid to voice. Officer Martinez's face had grown red during Mrs. Jefferson's testimony, and when Judge Harrison asked if he wanted to cross-examine the witness, he declined with obvious reluctance. Marcus thanked Mrs. Jefferson and helped her down from the witness stand, his courtesy and respect evident in every gesture. Then he returned to face Judge Harrison, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, not just education and dignity, but something that made Bruce's blood run cold with recognition. "Your Honor, I have one more piece of evidence to present to this court." He reached into his jacket pocket with his cuffed hands and withdrew a small leather wallet. From it, he extracted what appeared to be an identification card. "Your Honor, for the past 2 years, I have chosen to live in this community as a private citizen, hoping to find peace and anonymity after a career that demanded constant public scrutiny. But it appears that anonymity is not possible when prejudice and fear guide law enforcement decisions." Bruce felt his world tilt sideways as Marcus handed the identification to the bailiff, who carried it to Judge Harrison. The judge's face went through a series of changes as he read: confusion, surprise, shock, and finally something that might have been fear. "Your Honor," Marcus said quietly, "my name is Marcus Williams, but for 32 years I served as the Honorable Marcus Williams, Circuit Judge for the Superior Court of Camden County. I retired from the bench 2 years ago and moved to Millfield, seeking the quiet life that public service had never allowed me. I had hoped to find a community where I could contribute positively, perhaps volunteer with local organizations, maybe mentor young people interested in law or public service." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Bruce felt as though he had been struck by lightning. The man he had watched being handcuffed with casual cruelty was himself a judge, someone who had dedicated his life to the same system that was now failing him so completely. Judge Harrison's face had gone pale, and his voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "Judge Williams, this is highly irregular. Your Honor," Marcus continued with unwavering calm, "I present this identification not to seek special treatment, but to illustrate a point about justice and assumptions. If a retired judge can be repeatedly arrested and harassed in this community based solely on anonymous complaints and racial profiling, what hope do ordinary citizens have for fair treatment? How many others have stood in this courtroom, lacking both my legal knowledge and my resources, and been convicted of crimes they didn't commit?" The silence in the courtroom was profound. Bruce could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the whisper of fabric as people shifted uncomfortably, the distant sound of traffic outside. But mostly, he could hear the beating of his own heart as he processed the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Judge Harrison seemed to have aged 10 years in the span of a few minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Judge Williams, the court apologizes for this misunderstanding. All charges are dismissed immediately." But Marcus wasn't finished. He stood straighter, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of 3 decades on the bench. "Your Honor, with respect, this was not a misunderstanding. This was a systemic failure of justice, enabled by prejudice and perpetuated by a legal system that too often assumes guilt based on appearance rather than evidence. I spent my career trying to ensure that every person who appeared before my bench received fair treatment regardless of their race, economic status, or social position. What I experienced last night, and what I have experienced repeatedly in this community, falls far short of that standard." Bruce found himself holding his breath as Marcus continued. I do not seek an apology from this court, Your Honor. I seek a commitment to reform, a pledge to examine the practices that led to this moment, and a promise that other citizens of this community, citizens who lack my privilege and resources, will receive the same protection under law that the Constitution guarantees to all Americans. The transformation in Judge Harrison was remarkable to witness. The arrogant authority figure had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely shaken and uncertain. When he spoke, his voice carried a humility that Bruce suspected hadn't been present in years. Judge Williams, you're absolutely right. This court, I have failed in my duty to ensure equal justice. I don't know how to adequately address the harm that has been done, but I'm committed to doing better. Marcus nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and skepticism. Your Honor, actions speak louder than words. This community needs leadership that values justice over convenience, fairness over favoritism, and truth over prejudice. As the bailiff removed Marcus's handcuffs, Bruce felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. Relief that justice had ultimately prevailed, anger that it had taken such dramatic revelations to achieve it, and deep respect for a man who had maintained his dignity and principles even when the system he had served had failed him so completely. The crowd began to file out of the courtroom, conversations buzzing with shock and confusion. Some people looked genuinely ashamed, while others seemed angry at having their assumptions challenged so publicly. Bruce remained in his seat, watching as Marcus gathered his few belongings and prepared to leave. Mrs. Jefferson approached Marcus with slow, determined steps. When she reached him, she took his hand in both of hers. "Judge Williams," she said, her voice carrying across the now nearly empty courtroom, "I've been praying for this community to find its way back to decency. Maybe today was the beginning of an answer to those prayers." Marcus smiled for the first time since Bruce had seen him, an expression that transformed his entire face and revealed warmth that had been hidden beneath layers of dignity and restraint. "Mrs. Jefferson, your courage in testifying means more to me than any legal victory. Thank you for seeing the truth and having the strength to speak it." As they walked toward the exit together, Bruce found himself following, drawn by an inexplicable need to connect with this man whose story had intersected so powerfully with his own evening of observation and reflection. Outside the courthouse, the morning had grown brighter with patches of blue sky beginning to show through the overcast. Marcus and Mrs. Jefferson paused on the steps, and Bruce approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice slightly uncertain. "I was in the courtroom, and I wanted to say what you did in there was remarkable." Marcus turned toward him, and recognition flickered in his eyes. "You were at the diner last night, weren't you? I saw you watching when I was arrested." Bruce nodded. "I'm Bruce Springsteen. I was just passing through town, but what I witnessed, it stayed with me all night." A smile played at the corners of Marcus's mouth. "The musician. I know your work. Your songs about justice and the working class have provided soundtrack to some of my more difficult judicial decisions over the years." The three of them stood together on the courthouse steps, an unlikely group connected by shared witness to injustice and its redemption. Mrs. Jefferson looked between them with the satisfaction of someone who had seen something good emerge from something difficult. "Judge Williams," she said, "would you consider joining us for Sunday dinner this week? My church family would be honored to meet you properly, without all this courtroom drama." Marcus's expression softened further. "I would be grateful for that invitation, Mrs. Jefferson. It's been a long time since I felt truly welcome in a community." Bruce found himself speaking before he had fully formed the thought. "Would you mind if I joined you? I mean, if it's not too presumptuous. I'd like to learn more about your story, about what brought you here." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Mr. Springsteen, I think there might be value in that conversation for both of us." As they exchanged contact information and made plans, Bruce reflected on the strange chain of events that had brought them together. A random evening, a chance witness to injustice, a morning in court that had revealed truths none of them could have anticipated. Over the following days, Bruce found reasons to extend his stay in Millfield. He rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town and spent his time exploring, writing, and preparing for Sunday dinner with Marcus and Mrs. Jefferson's church family. The more he learned about Marcus Williams, the more impressed he became. The man had indeed served with distinction as a circuit judge, known for his fairness, his dedication to civil rights, and his innovative approaches to rehabilitation over punishment. He had retired at the height of his career, citing a desire for a simpler life and time for reflection. But there was more to the story, pieces that Marcus shared gradually during their long conversations over coffee and walks through the changing autumn landscape. He had been married for 25 years to a woman who valued status and social position above all else. When he began expressing interest in retirement and a quieter lifestyle, their marriage had fractured irreparably. She couldn't understand why I would want to give up the prestige, the influence, the comfortable life we had built, Marcus explained as they sat by a small pond on the edge of town. But I had seen too much pain in my courtroom. Too many lives destroyed by poverty and prejudice and lack of opportunity. I wanted to find a way to contribute that didn't require wearing a robe and wielding a gavel. Bruce understood that feeling, the weight of public responsibility and the longing for authentic connection to community. So you came here looking for anonymity. I came here hoping to find a place where I could be useful without being the center of attention. Maybe teach at the community college, volunteer with literacy programs, mentor young people who might be interested in law or public service. Instead, I found suspicion and hostility based entirely on my appearance. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A man who had dedicated his career to fighting prejudice in the justice system had become its victim in the very community where he sought refuge. Sunday dinner at Mount Olive Baptist Church was a revelation. The small congregation welcomed Bruce with curiosity, but without fanfare, more interested in getting to know Marcus than in meeting a celebrity. The meal was potluck style, with dishes that spoke to generations of tradition and community care. Pastor Robinson, a man in his 70s with gentle eyes and strong hands, offered a blessing that included gratitude for neighbors who stand up for justice and strangers who become friends. Bruce felt the sincerity of those words settle into his bones like warmth from a long-awaited fire. During the meal, Marcus shared stories from his years on the bench, cases that had challenged him, decisions that had kept him awake at night, moments when he had seen the legal system work as it was intended to work. But he also listened, asking questions about community needs and challenges, clearly searching for ways to contribute meaningfully to his adopted home. Mrs. Jefferson sat between them, serving as unofficial moderator and occasional translator when legal concepts needed explanation for the broader group. Her wisdom and warmth created a bridge between different worlds and experiences, making room for understanding and connection. "Judge Williams," asked Sarah Robinson, the pastor's wife, "what would you say to young people in our community who don't believe the justice system can work for them?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully. "I would tell them that the system is imperfect because it's operated by imperfect people, but I would also tell them that change is possible, that every generation has the opportunity to improve on what came before, and that their voices and participation matter more than they might realize." He paused, looking around the table at faces that reflected decades of experience with both justice and injustice. "I would also tell them that real change often happens at the local level, in communities like this one, when people decide they're not willing to accept the way things have always been as good enough for the future they want to build." Bruce found himself thinking about his own music, about the songs he had written calling for change and challenging injustice. But sitting at this table listening to these conversations, he realized that songs were just the beginning. Real change required the kind of sustained commitment to community that Marcus embodied, the kind of everyday courage that Mrs. Jefferson had shown in that courtroom. As the evening wound down and dishes were cleared, Pastor Robinson approached Marcus with a proposal. "Judge, we've been trying for years to start a community legal clinic, a place where people could get advice about housing issues, employment problems, family matters, basic legal guidance they can't afford from private attorneys. Would you consider helping us get something like that started?" Bruce watched Marcus's face light up with genuine enthusiasm for the first time since he had met him. "Pastor Robinson, I would be honored to help with that project. In fact, I think I know some colleagues who might be willing to volunteer their time as well." Plans began to form immediately. Space in the church basement, volunteer schedules, outreach to other communities with similar needs. Bruce found himself volunteering to help with funding and publicity, seeing an opportunity to use his resources and platform for something that could make a real difference in people's lives. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Jefferson pulled Bruce aside. "Mr. Springsteen, I want to thank you for staying, for caring enough to be part of what's happening here. Sometimes change needs witnesses, people who can tell the story to others who might not otherwise hear it." Her words stayed with Bruce as he drove back to his cabin that night. He had come to Millfield by accident, drawn by nothing more than restless wandering and the need for solitude. But he was leaving with something much more valuable, a renewed understanding of how justice worked at the ground level, how community formed around shared values and mutual respect, how individuals could make choices that rippled outward in unexpected ways. Over the following weeks, Bruce divided his time between his music and the growing legal clinic project. He watched Marcus transform from a man seeking anonymity into a community leader, someone who used his expertise and experience to serve others while rebuilding his own sense of purpose. The legal clinic opened on a Saturday morning in November, housed in the renovated basement of Mount Olive Baptist Church. Bruce arrived early to help set up tables and chairs, working alongside church members and volunteers who had driven from neighboring counties to offer their services. Marcus stood at the entrance greeting people as they arrived, families facing eviction, workers dealing with wage theft, elderly residents confused by Medicare forms, young parents struggling with custody arrangements. Each person was met with the same dignity and respect that Bruce had witnessed in the courtroom. But now it was offered freely, without the formal barriers of judicial robes and elevated benches. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said to a woman in her 50s who entered looking anxious and overwhelmed, "I remember you mentioned having trouble with your landlord when we spoke at the grocery store last week. Let me introduce you to attorney Sarah Chen. She specializes in housing law and has some ideas that might help your situation." Bruce observed these interactions with growing admiration. Marcus possessed a remarkable ability to remember personal details and connect them to appropriate resources. More than that, he treated each person's legal problems as worthy of serious attention, regardless of their complexity or the money involved. During a quiet moment between clients, Bruce approached Marcus's table. "You know, watching you work today reminds me why I write songs about justice and fairness. You're making those abstract concepts real for people who need them most." Marcus looked up from a stack of paperwork he was reviewing for an elderly man facing confusion over Social Security benefits. "Mr. Springsteen, Bruce, I want to tell you something. That night when I was arrested, when I saw you standing under that oak tree watching, I felt less alone than I had in months. Sometimes knowing that someone witnesses injustice makes it easier to bear." The weight of that statement settled between them. Bruce realized that his decision to stay, to become involved, had meant something to Marcus beyond just additional support for the legal clinic. It had provided validation that his experience mattered, that justice delayed was still worth fighting for. "Marcus," Bruce said quietly, "I've been thinking about writing a song about what happened here, about what you've built since then. Would you be comfortable with that?" Marcus considered the question carefully. If you write it, I hope you'll focus less on me and more on the community that made this possible. Mrs. Jefferson's courage, Pastor Robinson's vision, the volunteers who give their time every week, they're the real story here. As the day progressed, Bruce found himself helping in unexpected ways. He translated documents for Spanish-speaking families, made phone calls to clarify bureaucratic procedures, and simply listened as people shared their struggles and fears. By late afternoon, he understood that justice wasn't just about courtrooms and judges. It was about access, understanding, and the belief that everyone deserved to be heard. The legal clinic served 43 people that first day. Bruce watched Marcus work with each one, never hurried, never dismissive, always focused entirely on the person in front of him. It was a masterclass in dignity and service, a demonstration of how legal expertise could be deployed in service of community rather than personal advancement. As they cleaned up at the end of the day, Pastor Robinson offered a closing prayer that included gratitude for second chances and new beginnings, for the courage to stand up and the wisdom to build up. Bruce felt those words resonate deeply, thinking about his own journey from witness to participant, from observer to advocate. The weeks that followed brought unexpected developments. Word of the legal clinic spread throughout the region, attracting attention from law schools interested in placing student volunteers and established attorneys looking for meaningful pro bono opportunities. Marcus found himself coordinating a network of legal services that extended far beyond Millfield's borders. But it was the local changes that meant the most. Judge Harrison, shaken by his encounter with Marcus, had begun implementing reforms in his courtroom, requiring more specific evidence for arrests, providing interpreters for non-English speakers, and establishing clearer procedures for handling complaints about police conduct. Officer Martinez, the young policeman who had arrested Marcus, requested a transfer to another department, unable to face the community after his testimony was so thoroughly discredited. His replacement was Officer Janet Torres, a veteran with strong community relations skills and a commitment to de-escalation techniques. Bruce documented these changes through conversations with community members, watching how individual actions rippled outward to create broader transformations. He began to understand that lasting change required both dramatic moments of truth-telling and sustained work to build new systems and relationships. One evening in December, as the first snow fell outside Murphy's diner, Bruce sat with Marcus and Dorothy, discussing the changes they had witnessed over the past few months. The diner had become an unofficial community center, a place where people gathered to share news and plan cooperative projects. "You know what I've learned," Dorothy said, refilling their coffee cups, "is that change doesn't happen all at once. It happens person by person, conversation by conversation, decision by decision. What you two started that night has become something nobody could have predicted." Marcus smiled, the expression coming more easily now than it had during those first difficult months in Millfield. "Dorothy, I think what we discovered is that every community has people ready to do the right thing. They just need someone to show them how to start." Bruce thought about the songs he had been writing during his extended stay in Millfield. They were different from his earlier work, more intimate, more hopeful, more focused on the possibility of redemption and transformation. The music emerged from his daily experiences in the community rather than from abstract concepts about social justice. "Marcus," he said, "I want to ask you something personal. Do you ever regret leaving the bench? Do you miss the authority, the ability to make decisions that affect people's lives directly?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching snowflakes collect on the diner window. "I've thought about that a lot. Being a judge gave me power, but it also isolated me from the communities I was trying to serve. Here, working in the legal clinic, living as a regular citizen, I feel more connected to the actual impact of the law on people's daily lives." He paused, then continued with quiet conviction. "I can reach more people through this clinic than I ever could from the bench." And more importantly, I can empower them to understand their rights and advocate for themselves. That feels more valuable than any ruling I ever made." Dorothy nodded approvingly. That's the difference between ruling over people and serving with them. As winter deepened, Bruce found himself reluctant to leave Millfield. His initial plan had been to stay a few days, but weeks had stretched into months, and each week brought new developments that made departure seem premature. His manager called regularly, wondering about tour plans and recording schedules, but Bruce found himself more interested in the daily rhythms of community life than in the demands of his music career. The legal clinic had expanded to include financial counseling, job placement services, and educational workshops on topics ranging from tenant rights to small business development. Marcus had recruited retired colleagues to volunteer their expertise, creating a comprehensive support system that addressed the interconnected challenges facing low-income families. Bruce contributed not just funding, but also practical support. He helped transport clients to appointments, participated in community meetings, and used his connections to secure resources that might otherwise have been unavailable. He discovered that celebrity had its uses when deployed in service of concrete goals rather than personal promotion. One Saturday morning in January, as Bruce was helping Marcus prepare materials for a workshop on expungement procedures, Mrs. Jefferson arrived at the clinic with an unexpected visitor, a young reporter from the regional newspaper who had heard about the legal services and wanted to write a feature story. "Judge Williams," the reporter said after introducing herself, "I'm interested in how this clinic got started and what impact it's having on the community. Would you be willing to share some background?" Bruce watched Marcus consider the request carefully. Publicity could bring additional resources and volunteers, but it might also attract unwanted attention and compromise the intimate, trust-based relationships that made the clinic effective. "I'll speak with you," Marcus said finally, "but I want to focus on the community members who make this work possible rather than on my own story. The real news here is how people have come together to solve problems and support each other." The resulting article, published 3 weeks later, captured the essence of what Bruce had witnessed: a community discovering its capacity for justice and mutual aid, led by individuals who chose service over self-interest. Marcus was featured prominently, but as one voice among many rather than as the central figure. The story brought visitors from other communities interested in replicating the model, law students seeking internship opportunities, and funding organizations looking for innovative approaches to legal aid. Bruce found himself serving as an unofficial coordinator, helping manage the increased attention while protecting the clinic's essential character. During this period of growth and visibility, Bruce had several long conversations with Marcus about the nature of leadership and social change. Marcus's insights, shaped by decades of judicial experience and recent months of community organizing, provided new perspectives on themes that had run through Bruce's music for years. "The mistake most people make," Marcus explained during one of their evening walks through Millfield's quiet streets, "is thinking that change requires heroes, exceptional individuals who single-handedly transform society. But real change happens when ordinary people decide to use their skills and resources in service of something larger than themselves." Bruce nodded, thinking about his own evolution from observer to participant. "So what you're saying is that anyone can be part of creating justice, not just people with formal authority or special training." "Exactly. Mrs. Jefferson didn't need legal training to testify truthfully in court. Dorothy didn't need political experience to create space for difficult conversations in her diner. You didn't need to be from this community to recognize injustice and decide to help address it." These conversations found their way into the songs Bruce was writing, creating music that celebrated collective action and shared responsibility rather than individual heroism. The themes felt more mature, more nuanced than his earlier work, reflecting the complexity of real-world change-making. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility. The legal clinic had served over 300 people since opening, with success stories ranging from prevented evictions to resolved wage disputes to successful appeals of denied benefits. More importantly, it had created a network of relationships that strengthened the entire community's capacity to address challenges collectively. Bruce realized that his extended stay in Millfield was drawing to a natural conclusion. The clinic was well established and sustainable. Marcus had found his place in the community, and the initial crisis that had brought them together had evolved into ongoing systems for promoting justice and mutual support. But before leaving, he wanted to organize one final event that would celebrate what had been accomplished and ensure its continuation. Working with Marcus, Mrs. Jefferson, and Pastor Robinson, Bruce planned a community celebration that would take place in the town square on a Saturday evening in May. The event was designed to be both festive and substantive. Live music, food vendors, children's activities, but also information tables about community resources, voter registration, and opportunities for civic engagement. Bruce arranged for several musician friends to perform, but he also insisted that local talent be featured prominently. Marcus was initially reluctant to be recognized publicly, preferring to highlight the community members who had made the clinic possible. But Mrs. Jefferson convinced him that accepting acknowledgement was part of modeling leadership for young people who might be inspired by his example. "Judge Williams," she said with the firm kindness that had made her testimony so powerful months earlier, "sometimes allowing yourself to be honored is a service to others. Let them see what it looks like when someone uses their gifts for the benefit of everyone." The celebration exceeded everyone's expectations. Nearly 1,000 people attended, including visitors from neighboring communities and colleagues from Marcus's judicial career who had driven hours to show their support. Local businesses donated food and services, volunteers managed logistics, and the entire event reflected the collaborative spirit that had made the legal clinic successful. Bruce performed 3 songs that evening, including one he had written specifically about the events in Millfield. But the highlight was Marcus's brief speech, delivered from a simple platform erected in front of the courthouse, where his own journey toward community leadership had begun. "6 months ago," Marcus said to the assembled crowd, "I stood on these courthouse steps in handcuffs, wondering if I would ever find a place where I belonged. Today, I stand here as your neighbor, grateful for the chance to serve this community and humbled by what we have accomplished together." He paused, looking out at faces that had become familiar over months of shared work and mutual support. "What we have built here is not perfect, and it is not finished. Justice is not a destination, but a practice, something we must choose again every day. But we have proven that when people commit to seeing each other's dignity and working for each other's well-being, remarkable things become possible." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but more meaningful was the sense of shared ownership that Bruce observed throughout the crowd. People weren't just celebrating Marcus's contributions, they were celebrating their own involvement in creating positive change. As the formal program concluded and the evening shifted to informal socializing, Bruce found himself in conversation with visitors from other communities who were interested in adapting the Millfield model to their own circumstances. Each conversation reinforced his understanding that the principles they had discovered were transferable, even if the specific applications would vary according to local needs and resources. Late that evening, after the cleanup was complete and most people had returned home, Bruce walked one final time through Millfield's quiet streets. The town looked the same as it had on that rainy evening in October when he had first witnessed Marcus's arrest. But Bruce knew that appearances could be deceiving. The real changes were invisible but profound. Relationships built across racial and class lines, systems created to ensure equal access to justice, individuals who had discovered their capacity to contribute to community well-being. These changes would outlast any single person or event, becoming part of the community's ongoing identity and practice. The next morning, Bruce packed his few belongings and prepared for departure. Marcus insisted on driving him to the train station, providing one final opportunity for private conversation. "Bruce," Marcus said as they drove through the early morning countryside, "I want you to know that your decision to stay, to become involved, made all the difference. Not just in terms of resources or publicity, but in terms of validation and support during a very difficult time." Bruce felt emotion rising in his throat. "Marcus, I should be thanking you. I came here as a tourist, someone just passing through. You taught me what it means to be a citizen, to be part of a community in a real way." They drove in comfortable silence for several miles, each lost in reflection about the months they had shared and the friendship that had developed. As they approached the station, Marcus spoke again. "I hope you'll come back to visit, to see how things continue to develop. And I hope you'll keep writing songs about justice and community. The world needs artists who understand that change happens through relationships and sustained commitment, not just through protest and confrontation." Bruce promised to return, knowing that Millfield would always hold a special place in his understanding of how music and social action could complement each other. The train ride provided time for reflection on lessons learned and relationships formed, on the difference between witnessing injustice and working to address its root causes. Over the following months, Bruce maintained regular contact with Marcus and other community members, following the continued growth of the legal clinic and related initiatives. The model spread to other communities, adapted and modified according to local conditions, but maintaining the core principles of dignity, access, and mutual support. A year later, Bruce returned to Millfield for the first anniversary celebration of the legal clinic. The event was smaller and more intimate than the previous Springs Community Festival, but it carried deeper meaning for those who had participated in the clinic's development. Marcus had been elected to the town council, a position that allowed him to influence policy while maintaining his direct service through the legal clinic. Judge Harrison had announced his retirement, citing a desire to ensure that the next generation of judicial leadership reflects the community's commitment to equal justice. Mrs. Jefferson, now in her 80s but still sharp and engaged, had been recognized by the State Bar Association for her contributions to access to justice. Dorothy had expanded Murphy's Diner to include a small meeting room where community groups could gather for planning sessions and educational workshops. During his return visit, Bruce spent time interviewing community members for a documentary project he was developing about grassroots approaches to criminal justice reform. The stories he collected reflected the ripple effects of individual actions. Young people who had been inspired to study law, police officers who had changed their approaches to community relations, families who had learned to navigate legal systems that had previously seemed inaccessible. But the most significant story was Marcus's own continued evolution. The man who had sought anonymity in retirement had become a regional leader in legal reform, someone whose experience bridged the formal justice system and community-based advocacy. His influence extended far beyond Millfield, but he remained grounded in the daily work of serving individual clients and building local relationships. "Bruce," Marcus said during their final conversation of that visit, "I've been thinking about something you said when we first met, about songs providing soundtrack to judicial decisions. I realize now that justice itself requires a kind of music, a harmony between different voices and perspectives working toward common goals." Those words became the inspiration for Bruce's next album, a collection of songs about community, justice, and the possibility of redemption that drew directly from his experiences in Millfield. But more importantly, they represented his understanding that art and activism, individual talent and collective action, could create something larger and more lasting than either could achieve alone. The legacy of that October evening, a chance encounter with injustice that became an opportunity for transformation, continued to unfold in ways that none of the participants could have anticipated. Bruce's songs reached audiences who had never heard of Millfield, but who recognized the universal themes of dignity, fairness, and community responsibility. Marcus's legal clinic became a model studied by law schools and replicated in dozens of communities across the country. More significantly, it demonstrated that justice was not just something that happened in courtrooms and government buildings, but something that could be created through daily choices to see and serve each other's humanity. Mrs. Jefferson lived to see her great-granddaughter graduate from law school, inspired by the example of community advocacy she had witnessed growing up. Dorothy's Diner continued to serve as an informal community center, a place where differences could be discussed and common ground discovered. And Judge Harrison, in his retirement, volunteered at the legal clinic, bringing decades of experience to bear on the practical challenges facing low-income families. His transformation from obstacle to ally illustrated the possibility of personal growth and institutional change, even when both seemed unlikely. Years later, when Bruce was asked about the most meaningful experiences of his career, he always mentioned his time in Millfield. Not because it had produced hit songs or memorable concerts, but because it had shown him how individual actions could contribute to collective transformation, how art could serve justice, and how strangers could become family through shared commitment to each other's well-being. The story of Bruce Springsteen witnessing the arrest of Marcus Williams and everything that followed became legend in its own small way, told and retold in community meetings and law school classrooms, in church services and coffee shop conversations. But its real significance lay not in its drama or its unexpected turns, but in its demonstration that ordinary people, faced with injustice, could choose to act in ways that created extraordinary change. The courthouse steps where Marcus had been arrested were eventually marked with a small plaque, recognizing the site as the birthplace of the Millfield Community Legal Clinic. But the more important monument was invisible, a network of relationships, systems, and shared commitments that continued to promote justice long after the initial crisis had been resolved. In the end, the story was not about a famous musician or a distinguished judge or any single individual. It was about what became possible when people chose to see beyond appearances, to act despite uncertainty, and to believe that justice was not just an abstract ideal, but something they could create together.